Welcome to the Times Arrow podcast. My name is Guy Wilcox. I am absolutely delighted to be here today with Ama Codjoe, poet and author of Blood of the Air, which won the Drinking Gourd Poetry Prize for chapbooks, delightful collection, and most recently of the Bluest Nude, which came out in September of last year. So, welcome, Ama.
Thank you.
So we are in the Berkshires at the Amy Clampett house. Can you tell us a little bit about what the past 6 months have been like for you?
Yeah, so the Amy Clampett house is like this basically generosity of space for poets to be in residence for 6 months to a year. And I was here January to June, so mostly wintertime, which I didn't know I'd love, but it was so cozy. The house is like spacious, especially if you're like coming from New York, New York City. There's a fireplace. And there's a really great library that's just up the hill. So I was reading a lot and kind of under blankets and I don't know, really enjoying like a quiet and a dark. There's no streetlights on the street that you don't have access to in a city normally. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And now we're filming, it's the end of June. And so summer proper will start, and your time here for now anyways will come to a conclusion.
That's
cool.
Right. Yeah.
Well, it's nice to be able to catch you here at the end of what I'm assuming was a beautiful process.
Yeah. And I'm happy that you're here. It's a good way to end. And I think there's so many things about a poet's life that is about like a gift that somebody gave them. Like it's either like somebody who wrote your letter of recommendation or your teacher or your mentor, or a lot of these residencies that are really built around, somebody dying, and maybe that's like an untimely death, and using like their resources to give them to other people. So yeah, I feel like my whole life as a poet is about like that generosity.
I love thinking about the gift. There's a book by Lewis Hyde called The Gift, in which some things sometimes exist in a market economy, but there's also a gift economy. And for art to endure, it doesn't necessarily need to endure in the market economy, but it definitely needs to endure in the gift economy. It needs to be this, I don't know, some abundance, which actually leads me nicely into a question that I wanted to ask you about, and it's one of the only kind of really strictly formal questions I have, even though I do have many informal questions, which is that I think when we go to art, when we go to even cinema, painting, photography, both of which feature in your writing, and certainly poetry, but even a lover, I think one of the things that's fascinating is finding that you're getting certain needs met that you didn't anticipate. And I think that's one of the most striking features to me about the Bluest Nude has to do with sensibility, because you weave lots of things, lots of subject material, seemingly. If I were to separate them out and say, well, we're talking about motherhood, we're talking about men, we're talking about whiteness and blackness, and we're talking about different elements of being alive in America or as a human being, sexuality, but they don't feel disparate in your work. And so the question here relates to sensibility, relates to almost sense of humor, because I don't find this collection to be funny, ha ha ha, right? But there is humor in surprising places. So my question, forgive me for the long-winded wind-up, but how did you arrive at a style that you could feel like is authentically you, that balances all of these features in a kind of, I don't know,
either.
floating way?
Certainly not, like by planning to do so. I guess maybe part of this is like in my story as a poet, like I kept my writing to myself for a long time. And I didn't do an MFA until in my 30s. I feel like there's something in that that's just like, I was just doing me, basically. I wasn't like for an audience besides myself. And then by the time that I was sharing my work with other people, I definitely care about what they think and want to learn from them. But at the same time, like, I don't know. I feel like I had like a confidence and a permission to kind of just be. And to trust that that's okay. Like, because at the end of the day, like, I do, and this, like, some people are different in this way, but I do write poems for myself. Like, that's my first goal. And I guess I trust the reader to come, like you're saying, with their own stories and selves and kind of find a path. And it might not be the one that, like, I laid out.
Right. We become like detectives kind of gathering clues in order to construct a kind of meaning. And we, I think, want that meaning to resonate for us, but we also want it, is this, and I'm very skeptical of readers laying claim to an author's intent about a work. I think that's very tricky ground to try to tread. At the same time, we still want to connect. We still want to fulfill our half of the bargain, I feel like, as readers, by almost like a cat bringing something to a doorstep and be like, I retrieved this for you, as an expression of care, as a reader. Okay, so you wrote privately to create things that you were happy with, presumably. Were there other methods besides writing poetry of artistic expression that can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I don't really know.
Sure. About it. I mean, I was a dancer for like a really long time.
Oh.
Yeah, from when I was like 5. I got an MFA in dance, actually.
Oh.
And I feel like that kind of art making was very different than writing. It's like very much your body is the instrument. Like it's presentational in a way that's what's different. And that's, I think, part of the reason why I kept the poetry to myself. Like there was this one part that was like, I'm on the stage and there's no like filter really. This is my body moving in space and time, and that's what dance is. And then I have this other stuff that's like I can kind of keep to myself. But then when I stopped dancing, I started turning to writing more, and then I think I started turning to writing with others, meaning like workshops and yeah.
I think that now that you mention it, and again, this might be just me as a reader bringing, what certainly is me as a reader bringing this idea to approach the work with this, but one of the things that, and again, I wouldn't call it a device or something that you're necessarily employing consciously, but which it provides this incredible invitation, is there's a mix of, as in dance, of real frankness about the body, and then certain parts that are only refracted, that you can only see a bit about. But because there is the frankness there, that refracted piece, for lack of a better phrase, we kind of have a trust that there's a full picture there and that we can seed our own way into it. And this happens sometimes at the endings of poems, as in a poem that I believe is called At the Fish House, and in Labor, and a number of the other longer poems as well. I guess the word that's coming to mind then is trust. There's some pathway of trust that needs to be generated. Maybe you could talk about if that applied to your world of dance, but also you certainly I don't say name check a lot of artists in this book. Many of them are not writers. Some of them are, and it's interesting to see those points of intersection. But in terms of thinking about trust, in terms of thinking about frankness, where do you find yourself going these days for nourishment along those lines?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot that has to do with my dance practice that feels like a part of my sensibility, in a way that I'm not necessarily conscious of, I think. Like, I feel very embodied as a person, and I think there's some people who don't, you know? And so that shows up in my poems. And I'm one of those people who just, like, likes to go to museums. Like, that's a nourishment for me. Like, seeing art is just, like, yeah, it's a joy. And so I turned to literature. I turned to, like, visual art, photography, not so much film, to find, like, the resonances, to feel like I'm learning. I'm also, like, it's that thing of, like, not being alone, you know, like, I don't know who I would be without being a reader. And I think recently I've been thinking about, I guess, like, nonfiction. Like, I've been reading a lot of nonfiction, and I've been kind of diving into stories that might be, I don't know how to put this, that I might kind of shield myself from, like, hard truths. Yeah. Because something in me feels like, well, you just have to face this hard thing. Yeah, I don't know.
Does that have to do with just your Ama as a person? Or now that you've got these works into the world, is there I don't want to say encroaching feeling of responsibility related to taking on certain subject material, whether it's going forward or going backward? I mean, do you start to register that at all, or is it more kind of just coming from your own life?
Yeah, my own life. Which I guess, like, one assumes that your own life keeps coming into your own work, right? But I don't know. Like, I'm not a planner when it comes to the poems. Like, I think there was a moment where this book became itself, but I didn't start off, like, 5 years ago. Like, I'm going to write a book, and it's called Bluest Nude, and it's going to be about these subjects, you know? So it's more, the reading that I'm doing now that I feel like is challenging myself is more for me. But I do think that ethics maybe will show up in my writing. Yeah.
And it is present already in profound ways, but also in kind of, I don't say understated ways, but in kind of, they're delicate and clear, which is kind of interesting. Like your inclusion of ain't gonna study war no more, which is, the effect of it doesn't feel didactic when you read it. The effect of it kind of feels delicious. It's sumptuous. It's like kind of reveling in a discovery. I think, I feel like you try things on. The voice in your poetry enjoys trying things on, taking things off, just exuding presence and allowing that to happen. And sometimes those things that are taken on don't sound like they would be comfortable. Sometimes they sound luxurious.
Yeah.
But you allow for all of that to happen. I just wanted to mention before it slips from my mind that I think in the conversation about this collection that I've checked out, there's a fair amount of talk about seeing and being seen, and that factors directly into one of the most delightful poems in the collection, and photography. But there's a lot about painting in here as well. And in fact, you'll even write a poem and then do kind of a detail, which is allowing. It was such a wonderful moment to see that and to read the poem, because the thing that you get to enjoy when you're enjoying visual art gets ported over here in a beautiful way, and you're like, oh, that's such a nice move, because you didn't. Let me sit with that a little bit longer in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
And then finally, sorry for all this but just gushing. But then the one of the poems in which you talk about your father ends with one of these great moments where you're being told by museum staff that you were too close to the painting, which the effect of that when you come to the end of it, you're like, oh my god. It's anyway. So
no, thank you for that.
Sure.
Though, yeah. I mean, just to say thank you for reading the work so closely.
Your work has a very powerful sophistication, and that comes from whatever process it is. I imagine you do. As you mentioned, you're not a planner. You're not saying like this is how the blueprint's going to work for constructing a poem, but you've been able to achieve this kind of X factor, which is like being in a place where, at least for the work heretofore, you kind of know how to drop in. So maybe the question is, like how does revision work for you?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I feel like I learned how to write through thinking about revision. Like, I think I thought as a early writer, the job was just to write. And then I learned that revising is a kind of writing. And for me, like, I need time away from the poem to actually see it. I don't feel very anxious about my writing. I know some people do. I feel like really excited when I write something. I'm like, this is the best. It's not, and then I have to like no, it's actually not. And then I put it away, and then I actually have some perspective. I look at it again. I'm like, oh, I mean, it's not the best. These are the things that's happening, or these are some things that I would like to happen. Like, I can kind of go through even like this question of what's at stake? Like, like what is the poem doing? If it's like kind of a nothing poem, then that's not great. And I have to figure out, what am I really willing to like reveal or share or kind of put on the line. So yeah, the revising is really the writing. Like, I take a long time in between looking and not looking at poems. And in part that's because I really do like to write in spaces that are residency spaces where like most of your kind of daily needs are taken care of, and like it's totally a luxury, but like that's my preference. Like, I'd love to just be in a quiet place and not having to worry about the day-to-day, especially with poem making. And then I'll go back into kind of my everyday life and the bustle, and then a couple months later, I'll look at it again and be like, what's here? And then what's not here? So yeah, revision is like kind of it.
Well, it's a special talent to be able to continually manifest your preferences across time, which what I'm kind of hearing then is part of what it sounds like is in your, I don't like this expression, but I'm just going to use it, like poet's toolkit, which sounds like, there'll be a test on this later, but something that's a part of your inner constellation is knowing how to manage things across time and being comfortable with saying, like, just because I'm placing this here doesn't mean it's forgotten. It's just going to go hang out in my subconscious for a while.
Yeah.
So, like, what is that? I mean, is that also, I don't want to ask a personal question, but it seems like that's such a big deal in a way that it must just kind of also be how you live in a way.
Yeah, I want to hear more what you mean, but I'm feeling like yes.
Okay. Well, just hearing you talk about revision, and maybe this brings up the word trust again too, is there's a trust that in the fullness of time, revisiting this thing will you'll be at a place and it will be at a place, even though ostensibly it's, black and white characters on a page and they haven't moved, but they've moved somehow,
Right.
or they've revealed certain part of its essence that it wants you to continue to cherish, and the other parts can fall away. So that means that if we're taking this line of exploration, that you are very comfortable with that process and how it works for you in your life, and it's a way for you to turn more things into gifts. And that sometimes certain things are ready and you'll deal with that, and then other times things will be ready later, and you know that that's true too.
Yes.
So I guess that's
Yes. And also that it may not be like the poem is giving me something around like meaning. The poem is gifting me something, even though I wrote it. The poem is gifting me something. It doesn't have to be published to be worthy or valuable, right? And whatever, even if it's a poem that's never published, it gave me something, and I'm bringing that something to whatever I'm writing after that. So, in some ways, it's like purpose, or like thinking about what the purpose of writing is for me. Like the book is like a very ready-made way to share something, right? But before the book, there are all these ways that poetry is giving me something that's of value, even if I was not ever going to share it with you.
That must help re-clarify and define the things that are personal and the things that are public. Now that we know what it means to have books into the world, there's the things that are just yours, and certain things must go back and forth across that line a little bit. Maybe things that, I don't know.
I think, again, like coming to poetry in a more professional setting later in life, like I think about Sharon Olds and how she basically said to her parents, you don't read my poems. And whether they did or not, that's like whatever, but they didn't discuss them with her, right? And she needed that boundary in order to feel like she could make and really excavate and like kind of do some very wild things, right? For me, like, I feel like it's part of my integrity to just make the things I want to make. I'm not trying to hurt anybody. I'm not trying to be mean or whatever. But I have to feel like I can kind of move in the world how I need to move in the world. So that's what I do. And I happen to have a family that is okay with that, or who supports me, actually. But I think audience, which is part of what you're asking about, it's like another tier of thinking. It's very far away from my making and even my revision. I'm not thinking about anybody, I'm just trying to make the thing.
Is when you were describing that poems gift you things without needing to be in the public space, without needing to be in their making, the kind of notion of stewardship came to mind, and it's interesting to think about that not just in the context of a single piece of writing, but in the context of forming what ends up becoming a collection, and then planning aside the manifestation of collections over time is a thing, right? Yeah. So I suppose my question is, just on a day-to-day basis, is it just kind of about listening and trying things, and just kind of there's like a barometer or a compass that is leading you, but then you're also interacting with these nonfiction texts and being in different places, which must also, because this book feels it's not what I would classically call a New York City book of poetry, but the cities in this book, apartment life, what for lack of a better term might be called like just stating and experiencing people in the city. But then when you take us to Captiva and you take us to different places, and those are all present and integral. There's a question in here somewhere. No, but, okay.
Yeah.
So maybe one particularly notable sequence throughout this book that also interacts with this idea of public and private is what I've wrongly and refer to in my own mind as the kind of fill in the blank sequence, but it's the kind of after the, normally there's a blank. Sometimes you surprise us by saying what the event is. And those produce varied effects and wonderful effects, but also not just within the certain poem, but across the sequence. And then it's also a venue, in a way, for you to do this very unique version of, I don't love the term wordplay because I feel like it's a little shallow of a descriptor. But what I would say, and forgive me, coming to where you are is also just a chance to just kind of celebrate and, kiss the hem and appreciate the work. And I think that instead of wordplay as such, as a descriptor, there's this idea that you are bringing in a word that comes out of a situation and interaction with a person, and then allowing the echo of that word to also manifest and appear, because that's part of what you get when you get certain words and experiences. And so instead of kind of stiff arming that out, you allow it in, but you're able to maintain the thread. So we go through this journey, but it doesn't feel like a departure into some sideline. It feels like we're getting more meaning. We're getting more resonance. We're getting a vroom, vroom, vroom thing happening.
Yeah.
My question then would be, how did you know this was a series?
Yeah, I mean that series of poems started as one poem. It has a interesting origin story, which is that I was in New York City during the beginning of the pandemic, and I left to go to where my mom lives. And I was like doing all this research online. This is a time where we don't know much like about what's going on and what to do, and like we're still thinking like we touch things, and that was like no one's wearing a mask. Okay. But I had done enough research to know like I needed to wear a mask, and I wanted to like self-quarantine for 14 days before I saw my mom. And so in that 14 days, I wrote this poem, which became this series. And I never really write like that. Like it was like a place, like all my anxieties, like all of my like thinking about what is the end of the world, like, and what are the kinds of different versions of what that might mean. So then I published that at the Yale Review, and it was a part of this anthology, Together in a Sudden Strangeness, that Alice Quinn edited. And then my friend Jenny Shea read it, and she was like, I hope that's in your book. And I was like, well, it's not in my book. Like, and then I thought, is there a way to make it in the book? And that's actually where the blanks came from, because it allowed it to be more malleable and not so like kind of site specific, even though it kind of touches on things, right? So, and then I broke them up and I kind of placed them near poems that were resonant, and that's how they became a part of the book.
I mean, it's fantastic. And so many things. We talked a little bit earlier about readers bringing themselves into the work. So having a blank there is kind of an interesting device that way. But it's also, you're not naming it. You're just naming it this underscored line with a blank on top. And that's interesting too, because there may be literary art that decides that it's going to obviate or obscure, but you've just kind of named it this thing, and then we all kind of to it, like a little singularity. And then at various points, you do.
Yeah.
And that's surprising and wonderful. That series, and it also it's also the one of the places in the book where you bring in more explicitly political, what I want to call like political emotion.
Yeah.
Can you?
I love that.
Yeah,
that phrase. That's so good.
Well, because I think that certain things are inflected and implied without having to be, there's no need to state it explicitly, but what we can share is that those packages of feelings.
Yeah. What kind of what's given off by that, or what? I think, yeah, I mean, I was very angry about the mishandling of this pandemic, and that's certainly in the poem. And I think in general, I guess I feel like what is the difference between the newspaper and poetry, right? I don't feel like my job is to report in the same way, although journalists are very, very important. But a poem to me is trying to get at something different, which is, it's more swirly. It's more like the mind moves. It's more inexplicable. So it's not so much the fact or the factoid. It's the political emotion. Yeah. What am I feeling? And that feeling feels like it in some ways could be timeless. Right? There's something about, it's part of our humanness, how we move in the world. We all have a particular timeline and time frame and era and set of problems, but of course, generations before had their own, and some of the feelings that they felt are similar to the feelings we feel. Right? So there's some.
This comes out even when when you're talking about, I think that the term you use is kind of like king, but yeah. It's certain things are changing, and then certain things are quite notably not changing,
right?
And are almost paradigmatic parts of the architecture of whatever this society is.
Right. Yeah.
There's an element of I feel like there's a connection to dance in that somehow too, about there's a kind of interacting with a pattern, but being kind of free in it too. I know it's kind of abstract. But.
No, I mean, it does. It's the same. Yeah, the repetition. What does repetition do? How much of it do you need to feel like it's deepening? Yeah, I think that's it could be a sound thing, but it can also be a visual thing. That feels like an element of both dance and poetry.
This must also be some byproduct of the fact that you kept your writing to yourself for a while as you became a mature woman, because my impression is that for people who bring their poetry out at a young age, and this is obviously quite varied, so I can't make a blanket statement about this, but that identity gets formed in a quickened sense in relation to the poetry, and then certain things become part of the set of things, and other things become outside the set, unless there's a shift of writing switch. But I think one thing that makes your work really refreshing to read is that you'll be kind of going down a jag and being discovering this and then discovering this, but then but this also is true, and then the thing that I was talking about is sometimes false, and it's that's a very I don't know, adult. I don't know. It's something that happened. That's a very like later reality type understanding. That is, it's just nice because I think we live I get it, but we live in an age where there's a lot of, frankly, like just everything's polarized. And it's natural that a lot of the artwork would also become that way, and it has. And I don't, everything should be as it wants to be, so that's great. But it's also great to be in a poetic and imaginative space when certain things are strongly articulated, but then also other opportunities are provided too. So there's like the changing.
Yeah, that has to be. It has to be. I mean, that's one of the reasons why like art and creativity are important generally, is like the room for imagining, I guess, like elsewhere or otherwise or an alternative. Like that's kind of, if we think, if we give in to a very truthful inevitability, like we're just kind of sailing along to our destruction. Like, I mean, you can think about it in so many different ways, including like our, climate and our earth. But if we like exercise the right to dream and imagine and make, like it impacts how we see the world, impacts how we see our options for social action. Like it's not, frivolous. Like, I mean, like it's Audre Lorde, like poetry is not a luxury. It's not a luxury because we need that kind of language making and dream space to be able to imagine ourselves into livable worlds.
There it is.
Yeah, we need it.
There's a lot to talk about, but I just wanted to kind of pause on that for a second because that's really, it's really foundational. It reminded me of that old kind of Benjamin Franklin, phrase, like a republic if you can keep it. And it's like, well, what does that keeping entail? And it must entail, and I think it's easy to just think about it as like something that has to do with politics or something that has to do with even grassroots politics, but there's this other culture that needs to be happening, kind of like how mushrooms work in the soil and we look at the flowers, but it's like there has to be this other stuff happening too that creates the possibilities.
Yeah, the root systems and the trees communicating to each other underground.
Actually, in your acknowledgments, it's so lovely how you phrase that when you talk about, I guess, the libraries and schools and the residencies and the publishers and the editors as the I think you use the word root system or something to that effect.
Yeah.
It's lovely. It's something that the poetry doesn't stop with the last poem in the book. It kind of, you take time to acknowledge the whole kind of society into which this book was born.
Yes, because it's striking. I mean, I don't know if it's just for a debut author or not, but like when you think about it, you're like, wow, there are so many like handprints, on this. It's like unbelievable. Like I said before, so many generosities, like, and it really can be just like, I mean, that's the thing about teachers. Like, it can be just like a phrase. Like, if you can kind of sense someone's belief in you, like it's an indestructible gift. And yeah, I've had really amazing teachers and like peers, colleagues, friends that certainly, it doesn't matter if they read the poem, like they've contributed to the making of it.
Something that we haven't touched on yet, but I would feel remiss if we didn't, is also in both books, you've got a poem that's dedicated to Mr. Baz, and that is so uncanny in a way, like how you've done the poem, because it's obviously, it's a poem that grapples with political violence, race in America, the role in a way that, the broader Islamic community can interplay with all of these elements too. That's present ipso facto because of Malcolm X and the assassination. But it's also very of a piece with another set of continuing themes, which is the idea of motherhood, your mother, you discuss. I mean, I love the moment, and forgive me for not being able to identify the poem, but where you kind of describe kind of becoming a surrogate mother for a boy on a train who's kind of sleeping.
Yeah, that's labor.
That's labor. Okay, yeah, of course. And not to get away from burying seeds, the initial poem I meant to bring up, but that moment too, not only kind of, I think, perfectly encapsulates that feeling, which I think a lot of people could identify with a moment like that, but it also is just its own, that type of paradigm happens. I don't know, not just between a child and an adult, but it happens in other slipstream ways all the time. And I was very thankful that you kind of noticed and brought that into being, in the same way that your line about, I wish I were more like I want to be more like my eyes. Thank you for that. It's like, yeah. Okay, so just to return to this moment, all of the poems that are ostensibly about you and your personal stuff and your exploration of the world and your exploration of yourself vis-a-vis exes or other partners, is also grappled with being a black woman in America in a culture where political violence is a reality. And in one of the poems you also say, to something to the effect of, and forgive me for not having it by heart, but to talk about this is to also kind of name the color. Do you know what I mean by that line? I could be getting it wrong, but
Sure.
All I mean to say is that.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're talking about the title poem, Bluest Nude. Yeah, so, yeah, there was like a kind of return to police violence and tension between not wanting to describe it, but also wanting to name it that's happening. And talking about like this young black woman who is brutalized by police, and knowing that in some ways there's a mirror happening. Like, she's like me and I'm like her. And even though we're different, which is, I think, so much of what the book is. Like, there's so many points, even with like an Aunt Jemima figure.
Right.
There are all these ways that I'm putting on these masks, that I'm thinking about persona, but they're not dramatic monologues, Like, they're, in some ways, I'm finding like the thread that's about me in them. And it, in that way, I don't know. I think of it as like that is a thin mask. The mask is thin. Somehow
that is articulated in your kind of poetics in a very impactful way too, because actually there's a line which, where you take on the face of your mother and then you say, no, the mask of my mother. And I was just thinking about that for a while, because I was like, we needed both of those beats. And what you did is a refinement, but if you'd only kept the refinement, we would have lost something important. We needed kind of both of those steps. And I think that starts to point a bit towards this poetic space that you are not just occupying, but like kind of inventing and cultivating into being.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and let me know if you want to go back to the bearing seeds thing, but I feel like the invention part, I hope that's happening, but also part of the work of the book is to point to all these other artists and say, in some ways, like, I'm able to invent because, Betty Saar made this like assemblage in 1970 or 1972, or like there's so many predecessors for my work that make my work possible. And I think lineage is really important. And that's like a political lineage, and that's also like an artistic. Yeah.
It's true with Wanda Coleman when sometimes I call it your LA poem, but it's the
Heaven as Olympic Spa. Yeah.
First of all, it was just great to see, I don't know, the spirit of Wanda Coleman in a poem. That was just such a nice thing. And of course, she's
a little.
You.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about that to me is that sometimes maybe you can relate. There might be a work in which there's a lot of names brought in, but it feels like it's extraneous or it's baggage or it's trying to be something. This felt like you were honoring, and then but also just kind of being like, this is a launching point for this exploration. And it's kind of great to gather all those people up. And, this is silly, but there's a Paul Simon song that has to do with like all the girls I knew in high school or something like that. But there's a spirit of like, wow, getting all of these people that you mentioned together in a room kind of happens in this book. And that's got a cool vibration. I guess to put a button on burying seeds, was there something cathartic about that poem in particular? Because it seems to stand out in a slightly different way from the rest of the collection.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote it like working on this chapbook. So it was a longer poem than I'm used to writing. Like I was pushing myself to continue. And I think the tercets like helped with that. Like I feel like tercets have that rolling quality and they kind of can keep going. And I knew I wanted to write this poem for Betty Shabazz, which is how the poem starts. When I finished the poem, I just knew it was one of the strongest things that I'd written. And so I was like, well, I'm going to put it at the front of this chapbook. I'm going to send this chapbook out to contests and see like what happens. And in some ways, I mean, there are many centers for Bluest Nude, but it is like a poem that I wrote before I knew the book would be the book that is engaging in all of the themes that the book engages with, which like the naked body, blackness, like political motion, as you would put it, loss, grief, sexuality, like it's all in there. My own personal history and relationship to like my mother and my parents, and also like a political history. So yeah, it felt like a poem you remember you made, like it felt like a kind of like I feel like breakthrough is a little dramatic, but like it felt like something when I made it. Yeah.
You mentioned that Bluest Nude has many centers, and that feels true to hear you say. I agree. And one of those just that I wanted to bring up briefly as we kind of maybe achieve the fullness of time in this own conversation, is that you write about men in a very refreshing way, or different way than I'm used to encountering. And there's an element of it that I think part of the reason why is because your absolute, incredibly vivid but also economical use of language to conjure men. But then there are certain types of earth imagery, whether they're mountains or trees or goats, caribou, etc., that only really appear in that context. I guess that must be a part of the reality of your being in your life. But is there anything else that, I mean, was there something that you felt like you really wanted to make sure that you added a bit of that color about the experience of men?
I feel like the animals and the natural world, I mean, they're throughout, but I would love to read it again and think about if they kind of glom on to the men in the book. But I think there's something about, like, I guess you could say dating life. Like that is like a repetition. And that particular poem, Marigolds of Fire, where there's like this transformation of, the mountain goat and the caribou, and like it feels like I was both thinking about a specific relationship, and then I was also thinking about like the totality of specific relationships and the kind of pattern. So I guess that's again like what is a pattern? How does it break? What is repetition? Like, how does it actually function in our lives? Which I think my emotional life is very much influenced by repetition. And I want to be the kind of person, and hopefully that comes out in my work, that grows. And it's just not like circling, right? But that has some kind of insight upon repetition. So, yeah, I think the male lovers in the book, like that kind of aspect of the book, feels important to my life as it is right now. And I think that I guess it goes back to the not wanting to be a reporter thing. Like, I want to get at that. And somehow, sometimes that's like through like the natural world and animals and like, mountains and trees.
I mean, it's probably just my own experience also. I mean, I identify as a man, so, and I'm also a father, so, and your father is also in this book, but we don't meet him initially, although he does appear quite early on in Blood of the Air with the ring moment.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
such an incredible moment. And there are resonances to that in this collection, but we get it's kind of difficult to delineate and talk about, but we get the impressions of the lovers in the poem and their value, and it's there's an image that you use more than once, or kind of a verb really, about climbing into a tree or climbing into a mountain, and it may be related to, in a sense, that trying something on, but it's a refuge kind of feeling, at least that comes across sometimes in the moment, and then later, when in a very different context we encounter your father, some of that is baked in because he was a man who was with your mother, so like there's that in there too.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general there's like a lot of, well, you said trying on, and I think there's just a lot of like, there are a lot of mirrors. There are actually a lot of mirrors in the book, but there are a lot of mirrors metaphorically in the book. Yeah. Speaking
of which, forgive me for being cute, but I have one last question.
Okay.
Who is in that mirror?
Well, you know the answer because you've read the book.
Sure. Bluest Nude by Ama Codjoe. Thank you so much for speaking with us. It's a treat. We'll leave a place in the show notes for people to pick up a copy.
Thank you so much, Alan.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
My pleasure. If you enjoyed this and you would like other literary content, feel free to hit the subscribe button. Thank you very much.
At the Fish House, Captiva, Florida. I'm contemplating the difference between anger and resentment, but I'm interrupted each time a brown pelican crashes into the water, more recklessly it seems, because of the approaching storm. The water turns field and beast, like the mind, which is also like the body, tractor of memory raking the ground you become when loss, proof of your heart, confounds you. Another dives. I can't remember what it feels like to snare my tongue into someone's mouth or the date my grandfather died. It was a Tuesday in September. My mother woke me from stilted sleep. Pelican chicks dive so deeply inside a mother or father's gular pouch, the chicks were thought to be cannibals, feeding on the blood of their parents' breast. To my right, lightning like a thought cut short. From far away, the pelican spots the Manhattan, which my eye can't distinguish from water. I get no further than the question. A cold wind rushes from my eyes. I go inside, shut the windows.